to Knitwit Margaret Holzman, where we use knitting to explore our colorful side. Has it ever happened to you that you're walking down the street and a breeze comes up and flips over your knitted shawl or your scarf, exposing the wrong side of your work that has ends hanging out or just doesn't look tidy? Well, that's happened to me, and that's why I started using duplicate stitch weaving to deal with all of those yarn ends.
Okay, so let's weave in some ends on this flower show block as a demonstration. So we'll turn it over, and there's a whole lot of ends here needing to be woven in. Normally, you would want to start out by weaving in like colors on top of like colors, just so they don't show. But since we're trying to demonstrate something, we're going to weave in a yarn strand that's a different color onto this area here that's yellow. So I'm going to start by threading the strand onto the needle. This is a Susan Bates finishing needle. This is what they look like in the package. This is the one for medium weight yarn. I've got about maybe 8 inches of yarn here. Generally, I advise for worsted weight to leave about 6 inches. That's enough to weave in around 5 stitches, or to duplicate 5 stitches, plus another inch to embed the remaining little end into a channel created by the duplicate stitches. So first of all, I'd like to move this yarn a couple rows, or a couple ridges really, over, just to make it more visible. So I'm going to be weaving going counterclockwise. I have started by going up through a frowny face, which is not really what I want to do. So let me just go back, and I'll bring the yarn up through a smiley face. So you can see that on garter stitch, the ridges are composed of a smiley face, which is underneath, and a frowny face, which is on a little bit higher, and they alternate. So I'm going to come up on a frowny face, and then I'm going to follow this strand of yarn right here around, and I'm going to duplicate the stitches that are already knitted. And that's why this is called duplicate stitch. It's normally used on the right side of stockinette to add little color embellishments. So I'm going to start by following this strand around and down through the next frowny face, and then under the stitch below both of those strands, and then up the same frowny face, and then around to the next frowny face and down, and then underneath the stitch below. I'm going to tighten it a little bit. The tension should be about the same as the original knitted stitches. That's so that it doesn't distort the shape. And then we're going to go up through this. We always go up through the same frowny face we came down, and then we come down a new frowny face underneath the stitch below, up the same frowny face, down the next frowny face, underneath the stitch below, up the same frowny face, down the next frowny face. Whoops, just got unthreaded. And that's why, one of the reasons I like the Susan Bates needle, because it's very easy to rethread it. It's also very easy to work with a tiny little short strand, because the strands just alternate. They just float down to the other end of the needle. And so you can work with an infinitesimally small piece of yarn. So after I've woven about 5 stitches, I end by coming down back into this little valley between the stitches, and now I'm going to bury this yarn end. I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to insert the pointy tip of this needle between the stitches that I just created, my duplicate stitches, and the original stitches that are yellow. So I'm just going to embed it. I'm going to separate those duplicate stitches from the original stitches as best I can with the pointy end of this needle. If some of the yarn split, that's perfectly okay. And then I'm going to end down here, and then I'm going to draw this yarn end, make sure it's still threaded through, and embed this yarn end into the channel here. I usually pull it back a little bit because during normal use, this will stretch, and so I just try to pull that yarn into the channel. And so now I have finished my duplicate stitch weaving on this side. I got my little yarn end, which I could trim if I wanted. That's so small, I might just leave it. So it looks on this side, we can see it pretty well, right? Because we've done it in a different color from the original knitting. But if it was in yellow, we wouldn't see it very easily. And I'll show you a piece that'll demonstrate that in a minute. On this side, again, we see even less of it. We see kind of a little shadow stitch that's underneath the original knitting. If that was in yellow, you wouldn't notice that very much. So let's look at another piece. This was the original sample block that I did that has kind of a wonky center. I later designed this so it would be more round like that one. But anyway, so we got this one. So let's see if we can, this one that has already been, all the ends have been woven in. So let's see if we can find where we've got some duplicate stitch. And I see it right there. So there's some stitches that have a shadow stitch underneath them that's yellow. And so that is the original duplicate stitch right there. So there's probably some other areas here that have, there must be, but they're just very hard to find, right? You have to really scrutinize and look closely on the knitting. None of them are really coming to the fore for me. I don't see anything on that side. And you can see this is with all this, the ends woven in except for this one on the side. You can see how neat that looks, right? You don't see where the weaving is. You just see the nice texture of your garter stitch and your pick up and knits, and you would not be embarrassed to have someone turn your work over and take a look at it if it was neatly woven in like this. And yes, it does take a little more time, but I think it's well worth it. Another thing about this is that you would not want to weave in this way unless you're sure that you're not going to be frogging your work, because it's very hard to unpick, to even find it. You can find it while you're unwinding only, and that's not a good time to be finding your weaving. So you would want to make sure that you don't want to unpick this work before you would weave in using duplicate stitch weaving. One thing I wanted to mention is that when I cut yarns and add a new yarn, I don't fasten off or tie. I say that in my patterns, but I don't actually do it. I just actually start knitting with the new yarn. And that's because I use duplicate stitch weaving. There's so much friction that duplicate stitch weaving is never going to undo in normal use. Now that's true for acrylic and for wool blends, alpaca, any kind of like animal fiber that has fuzz and on the surface. But if you're using cotton or silk or any kind of smooth yarn, you would want to tie off just as a precaution, because those yarns are a bit more slippery and would tend to undo a bit more. I hope you found this video useful and that you'll incorporate it into your arsenal of useful knitting techniques and employ it in one of your projects soon. So subscribe and put some comments below to tell me what you thought of the video and to let me know what other types of videos you would like to see. Okay, happy knitting!